Welcome to the Point of No Return podcast, an exploration of strategy, leadership, technology, and entrepreneurship. Your host, Nectar, is the co-founder and partner at the PNR, a strategy consulting firm based in Montreal.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the Point of No Return podcast. I'm your host, Nectar. On today's show, I had the pleasure of speaking with Laurent Simon, Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at HEC Montréal. Laurent is one of the smartest professors I've known, and I'm really grateful that he took the time out of his busy schedule to speak with me. I've been bugging him for a while. He's, as I mentioned, a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at HEC. A little bit on his bio. He has such a wide range of academic interests, which I find fascinating. And we dive into what he thinks about entrepreneurship, innovation, and creativity. He created and teaches a master's level course of innovation management, and has received awards for pedagogical excellence. His research focuses mainly on innovation-minded projects, knowledge management, and how creativity is managed in different settings. He is the co-founder and co-director of Mosaic, HEC Montréal's Creativity and Innovation Hub, which focuses on research, knowledge transfer, and dissemination. He is regularly called on by private, public, and parapublic institutions to provide insight on these topics. We had a very wide-ranging conversation where we spoke about creativity in the video game industry, which was one of his early topics of interest, the notion of creativity itself and if it could be taught. We dive into universities and the need for universities to reinvent themselves, some of the work that HEC is doing there. We spoke about the innovation value chain, and then we spoke about finally the Summer School of Management of Creativity, Mosaic, where I first met with Laurent. Laurent is an incredibly interesting orator and speaker, and he shared some great insights about creativity. I think that you'll enjoy the conversation. A natural place to start, Laurent, in our conversation would be what got you interested in the topic of innovation? You've been working in the field for so long. I've never dug into the why. You know?
Well, it's actually, of course, a very good question. When, I was born in France, did part of my undergrad in France, and I arrived in Montreal to settle in Montreal in 94. 94, the internet was booming, the digital economy was literally, definitely starting up. So, I guess I'm a curious person. So I was interested in management and, organizational work and how, this new context would, transform the way we work. So, I got curious. I got curious about it. And it was a time where, the video game industry was actually starting, in Montreal with the arrival of the Ubisoft studio, for instance, and a lot of others, and newcomers, and that was a new world. So I was really curious about this new world. I wanted to understand how people would organize and thrive in this new world, actually.
Yeah. So I believe you started at HEC Montréal in 1996, right?
I came here before that as an exchange student, went back to France for a few years in the luxury industry in Paris, and then I decided to come back to Montreal. And then I did my master in management, and again, interested in this new way of thinking about work, the impact of the digital economy on organizations and on the way people would work.
Yeah. And when did you decide that teaching and research was going to be a passion and a lifelong pursuit?
Well, it happened during my master. I was coming from a family of teachers and professors and wasn't sure I would be interested in that. And I went through many interesting courses during my master's studies. I met with incredible professors, and then it got me into it. And I had a chance to start teaching in September 96, basic management course. And that was like, I wouldn't say an epiphany, but almost, I wanted to do this. I had fun doing it, explaining, trying to understand, debating about, knowledge and change. That's how it happened.
Yeah. So I didn't know that you came from a family of teachers, I imagine. So was it always something that you looked at your family and said, okay, I'm going to have to go into this field? And did you feel any pressure, or it just so happened that?
Not at all. I don't know if it's, the genes or whatever, but it happened. And my sister and brother of somehow went into the same field. So it just happened, but we didn't have any pressure.
Yeah, that's pretty funny. You spoke about the video game industry, and I know you've mentioned in the past you've worked a lot with the video game industry, and it's one which is known to be innovating. And I think it was also you came at a seminal time where the industry here in Montreal was blooming, and I've kind of know the field tangentially from my business partner Martin, that's worked in the field for many years. So what do you think caused that field to explode in Montreal at the time it did? I imagine there's a confluence of factors.
It is a confluence of factors. And what got me really interested in this industry was this convergence between, of course, technological innovation, this explosion of the digital possibilities, but also the creative part and the cultural part of the industry. You know, this mix of people with, you know, an aesthetic and experiential view, and of you know, uber geeks in terms of technology. So this encounter was really challenging to understand. It was a beautiful object for research. And you're right in terms of timing and momentum. I started my PhD studies in 96, when, you know, Ubisoft arrived in Montreal. A few, A2M was there, Behavior was already there, the studios, you know, old studios, and were starting, and they were asking us questions about how to organize, how to perform in creativity, in innovation, but also in you know, managing the projects in this industry. And another point that we shouldn't forget is that the state of Quebec at this time did an incredible bet on financing the industry through funding not infrastructures, but funding jobs, funding new jobs. And it was absolutely defining in the way the industry started to grow and really settled and in Montreal.
Yeah. So part of it is like a capital allocation strategy from the government that definitely played a big role. And I think continues to, if I'm not mistaken.
It's still in place, still, yeah.
And if you look at some of these big companies, one thing that surprises me is obviously the business model is profitable, right? Like selling video games is a growing industry. But what do you think explains this notion of the continuously pumping out games that work, right? The repetitive creativity part. That's always been fascinating for me. It's like, how do they manage to crank out these games and they get interest? And I imagine that there's misses, but we don't often hear about the misses and the recipe behind it.
Well, it's a very good question, and there's still part of a mystery somehow behind it. But first, all those people are passionate people. Historically, games have been developed mostly by gamers. Even if they are expert, they are developing a reflective stance on the product, on the process, on the industry, but they're all passionate people, and I definitely believe it helps. One thing that's also interesting is that, again, digital technology is still evolving at a very fast pace, so it opens opportunities to think differently about the product, think differently about the way you can use the technology to aim for more realistic, engaging, deep experiences. So somehow the technology is challenging the designers, and the designers are pushing the technology.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's like, again, it's people that use it also, right? So it's not people from outside of the field. And in your work now with the universities evolved beyond that industry, right? So now you're much more looking at a cross-sectional aspect of management, innovation. So curious to see how your work is evolving in your career, moving beyond that industry, into basically almost every industry today.
What, again, I believe I got lucky, in terms of momentum, because starting to work on the video game industry at a time where digital technology was blooming and accelerating and changing the world, all the other industries were also impacted. So I got interested in creative industries, in the cultural milieu, in the connections between, culture and technology. But also, along the way, it became quite obvious that most organizations were starting to be challenged by those changes. So innovation, creativity and innovation were less peripheral to organizations. They were becoming more and more central, more and more strategic capabilities to develop and to master. So that's why I got interested in different industries. And then I had a chance to work with another colleague working on the economics of innovation. And we started, getting really, really curious about the effects and but again, on the capabilities of organization. How can we learn to master the potential of digital technologies to innovate, to be more efficient, performing, but also more relevant to people?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting topic. It's basically the thesis behind starting my company. It's like, digital technologies will impact companies moving forward much more, like at a much greater rate. But at the same time, I look at it a little bit with a grain of salt, saying, technology writ large is playing a bigger role, but it's not the only factor. So curious as to what you think, this aspect of, you said companies can't be static anymore and need to evolve. What do you think are the main underlying causes of this acceleration of needing to be more innovative?
Again, it's probably a confluence of factors, but I believe it's a self-fulfilling process somehow. Digital technology also allowed for a faster circulation of information, somehow democratization of information. It contributed a lot to globalization. So people are more informed, are more curious. As users and customers, we became really demanding. I would say sophisticated, but really, really demanding. The value equation also of products and services, is really wider now. We're concerned by ethics, social impacts, environmental impacts, the way things work. So it brought a strong pressure on organizations, be they a private or public organization. So that's why, again, innovation is somehow, an inevitable answer to those pressures.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I find the analogy I like to use here is Wi-Fi on a plane. When there's, the first time you sat down on a plane and there's Wi-Fi, it's like this magical experience of like, oh my God, there's, I can actually connect now. And if you take a flight today, a few years after that, you're like, God damn it, why can't, I connect? So it's like this notion of consumer expectations are always rising is an important one. And I think it was in Amazon's letter to shareholders last year where the president said something very interesting. He's like, consumers are divinely discontent. Their expectations are always rising. So I think the fact that we use these platforms now makes our expectations much higher for every single customer touch point, right? Be it with the government, be it with your local grocery store, right? And that trend is not going away. So in line with that, I see how organizations need to adapt to something called the Red Queen effect. So it's like, the faster you run but you're staying in place. I'm kind of butchering it, but I think you kind of get the basic theory. Just curious as to how you look at it, for organizations, like what are guiding principles they need to look at, right? Beyond like, yes, understand technology is kind of important, right? Software is eating the world, but what are more macro level principles they need to take into account?
Well, what I believe is really somehow humbling about it is that the technology is here and the potential of digital technology is huge, yet it's still about people. So the focus we adopted was really a managerial focus, trying to understand how people could organize in order to harness the power of digital technology, but also in order to develop somehow this mindset. I know it's a buzzword now, but of agility, being able to change, being ready and open also to change. So that is what was fascinating in the last 20 years. Actually, see organizations letting go somehow the idea of systematic and mechanistic structures towards more organic structures that those new forms of organizations, they still need processes, they need meta processes, they need to be able to learn, they need to be connected to knowledge, and all those transformations were actually at the very core of our research.
Yeah. So I imagine there's not a 3 easy step process, right? It's a very kind of complex and ever changing subject. Do you look at any companies or organizations that mimic some of those behaviors that you mentioned that others can be inspired of, or is it too simplistic to say, well, you can't just copy paste what an Amazon or a Apple is doing?
That's a very interesting question. And from the researcher's point of view, what is striking is that context is important. We know some recipes, but dealing with the recipes, being able to adapt the recipes to local context is actually key. So it's always about not only learning about what innovation is about, it's about learning how to foster and manage innovation in your own context, in your own culture, in your own industry. So the basic principles, are always the same. You have to be ready to learn and be obsessed with learning. You have to be ready to share, challenge your beliefs, to foster also collaboration. You have to identify also purposeful challenges if you want to get people on board. And definitely you have to set up those, to enforce those short learning cycles, collective learning cycles. Again, it's about agility. It's about somehow humility. Also, we're trying things, we're learning from them, we're failing sometimes, and then we're trying again.
Yeah. Right. Now, I want to go to your work in the private world in a little bit, and the work that you've done with HEC, but maybe talk about your work with students, right? As a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation, curious as to how you talk about students today where they grew up in a world where all these things just like work, right? Like I remember, versus the people like of a certain age where it's like, we remember the pre-internet world. So curious how you teach entrepreneurship, and like what are some of the change, or some of the lessons I think that are important for someone entering the working world today.
Yeah, that's again a fascinating question, and actually that was and that still is a challenge, because as professors we were used to own the truth. And broadcasting the truth, literally in a classroom. And of course, that's not the way it works anymore. I started teaching when HEC introduced the PC in the classroom. It was the ThinkPad at this time. And so it means my competitor in the classroom is the whole internet world. All right. So my job has to be different. My job is not about pushing knowledge towards the students. It's about making sense out of this knowledge, and how we could, and even to try to understand collectively how we could make sense of this knowledge and make it to work. So it means we're less and less broadcasting knowledge and more staging collective learning experiences in the classroom and outside of the classroom. So where do we start? I think one of our challenges and responsibilities is about fostering curiosity, really introducing in the classroom elements of the real world, assessing how challenging they could be, getting students engaged in asking questions and even designing new questions. And that's the way we're working right now. And of course, we're introducing processes, project management is part of it, lean startup processes, agility. But again, the idea is how do you find and design the right questions? How do you also use a lot more empathy than before? Trying to understand the world and the world problems through the eyes and the experience of users. So we are doing that a lot, and it gets students actually very, very excited. Yeah. They think getting a deeper understanding of the world's issues, they get more involved and more concerned, and they want to have an impact.
Yeah. It's funny how you can look at the lens of how you work with, private companies to help them look at some of the principles that you spoke about. Curious to get your point of view. If you turn that lens inwards and look at the university as an institution, what do you think are the biggest, barriers to change? Because I imagine you're one of the, what's the words, like agents of change, to use a nice word.
Yes.
In an institution. Like, what do you think still needs to change beyond some of the way that you teach your classes today?
Well, that's actually that's a huge agenda, but we started already. I definitely believe that the model of the ivory tower is dead. So in terms of macro challenges, openness is key. Opening up to specific and concrete needs of organizations, of people, openness to different cultures, openness to different contexts. So that's one key element that we're introducing a lot of, lecturers, business developers, entrepreneurs, managers are actually teaching in our classrooms as well, getting also the students to getting involved in, I would say, more action research in the field, field work, meeting real people, working with and for real people. One of the key elements that we have to work on also is the format of the courses, 3 hours of lecture, one time a week for 12 or 13 weeks. We have to find more agile way to teach, more embedded ways to teach. So the institutional constraints are massive, but in terms of business schools, we're learning quite fast. I think teaching, training, the way we're doing research is changing. Part of it is changing.
Yeah. And you've also been a pioneer in helping bridge the gap with the corporate world. So you started something called you co-founded something called the Summer School of Management of Creativity. So curious to get your thoughts on what was the idea behind this summer school?
Exactly your previous question, actually. We were working with my fellows on trying to understand this, I would call it innovation value chain, working on knowledge, learning. How do you learn? How do you generate ideas, from what you've learned? How do you, work those ideas out, convert them into a value hypothesis, and how are you going to actualize them into, real products and services. All right. And quite quickly we realized that, theories could help, but we needed to understand the actual challenges of organizations and society. So we needed to get involved in those organizations, do more field work, enter into deep and dynamic conversations with them, and to get the students involved. So we started with the creation of a platform at HEC Montréal called Mosaic. And the idea of Mosaic was we need this platform, this hub to enter into this dialogue with managers, with employees, so we needed that. We wanted to play a role of, somehow of a bridge between students and organizations, researchers and organizations, but also between organizations, being able to work with Hydro-Québec and Bombardier and some SMEs and some startups and the healthcare system, and getting those people to meet and share their knowledge, best practices, sometimes failures about the introduction of innovation processes in organization. Yeah.
Without going into maybe some of the metrics, like the impact, the number of students, because you've been running this school now for a while. I'd be curious to see what your proudest accomplishment having built this.
Well, it's again about the development and this not only the platform and the research and the impact it had on our courses and programs, but setting up this community of interest around managing creativity and innovation, getting those people to talk, even when we are not here anymore. So this movement of curiosity about how to be more relevant to customers and users, and be more relevant to the world, and to see those people working together and experimenting, learning, sharing. Yeah.
I mean, like, I find the word creativity, is so used that sometimes it loses its meaning, I find, and just like agile and some of these other business buzzwords. I'm curious as to what do you think is the biggest aspect of it that's misunderstood when someone says, hey, we need to be more creative in our organization and we need a chief creative officer. What aspect of it is misunderstood?
Well, we did years of field work on those processes. And what is quite clear is that we have a profound misconception about what ideas are about. So talking about creativity as a talent or potential is one thing, but working on creativity means working on ideas. So, and we have this myth that's very from the Western world that, ideas are coming somehow from above, from somehow divine inspiration or serendipity or accident or pure talent. And what we've been working on for the last 10 years is to try to understand ideas as processes, to see how they could be fostered and managed and converted into value and solutions and options. And probably that's also one of the key point we've been arguing about a lot, is to refocus and recenter creativity and innovation processes about the debates about value, what value is and for whom, and not only economic value, functional value, symbolic value. Actually, innovation is about working on the evolution of value and value equations.
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject. I imagine we could probably talk about this for a while. I find that the whole aspect of creativity, like you mentioned, of turning it into something that could be repeatable and understandable beyond the, the famous, let's say, Steve Jobs aspect. I'll tell you what the customer wants, right? Like maybe for 1 in a million people, but for what's the expression, le commun des mortels, for the everyday person. It's something that I think you can work on and get better at, right? Is it the nature versus nurture debate, right? What you're saying is it can be nurtured over time and developed in any organization.
It can. We tend to see it somehow as a potential. If you have a brain and a heart and senses, you have this creative potential. So it has to be nurtured. It has to be cultivated somehow, harnessed somehow. But we tend to look at it as somehow as a muscle. We have muscle. You can train them in different ways. Curiosity can be trained. The ability to question and challenge things and statu quos and can be trained. So and we believe in the democratization of creativity, and that's a quote from Edmund Phelps. He was Nobel Prize in Economics in the 2006, saying our main challenge today is to democratize creativity, democratize ideas management, making sure that we're getting a lot of people involved around major challenges, the environment, inclusion of people, mobility, healthcare, education. We need more people working, debating, discussing, contributing, and that's how we are going to be able to make a difference. In terms of innovation processes, we talked a lot about open innovation, but we're still challenged to involve more good brains and people and more diversity around organizational challenges.
Yeah. You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation this notion of organizations needing to move faster, and I imagine part of it is also related to Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction, right? So like the cycle of, the birth and demise of organizations. I'd be curious to see as to what you're spending your time or your research on in terms of like the next evolution of this aspect, things that you think are not important today, but are going to start being much more important in the next few years.
There are a few main trends that we are looking at. One that's very obvious is, again, what the new development of digital technologies can bring to those issues, deep learning, the use of data, how we can frame problems, issues, challenges more precisely, or with more relevance using those technologies. So that is one thing that's actually very, very intriguing. And another thing is about this widening of innovation. Innovation can't be, if you consider the scope of the issues we're faced with, again, environment, mobility, healthcare system, education, inclusion, and so on and so forth. Those issues are more complex, are too complex to be addressed by one organization alone. So collaborative innovation, it's again another buzzword, but developing communities of innovation, ecosystems of innovation around those issues, is actually a major, economic and organizational challenge. So we're presently looking at the way to reorganize, innovation as a shared responsibility. Public, private organizations, users, new generations, for instance. Yeah.
Maybe a far out question is, do you see the very notion of capitalism changing, right? Because of this, right? Like, I imagine it's being challenged by different sectors today. So curious to get your thoughts.
Yes. It's clear that it's been said that the power of capitalism is its capability to constantly reinvent itself. The challenges of reinvention today are huge, but I'm still optimistic about the way we can get our economic system wiser about natural cycles, the environment, the way people work, people expectations as well. So, and I believe we are changing. The system is changing. Is the rhythm, fast enough? I'm not sure, but we're changing. And one good thing is that I personally deeply believe that we are learning. We're learning.
Yeah, this is maybe a great way to end the conversation, Laurent. It's been fantastic and very interesting. Maybe a final question for you is, where can people find out more about your work and your research?
Okay, good question. I would say, of course, we have a website, and we are not always really good at taking care of it. So it's a Mosaic website, or HEC Montréal website. But one thing I would say, we've been talking a lot about the digital and virtual and distant world. I would simply say, come and meet us. Come and meet the community. We have regular monthly events, 5 to 8 cocktails and lectures, master classes. Come and meet us and share, be part of the community, be part of the conversation. And, we still believe in face-to-face contacts and, conversation around, a glass of wine and, open-ended, debate. So come and meet us.
Yeah, it's still the best way to connect. So thank you so much for your time, Laurent.
Thank you very much, Nectar.
Thank you for listening to the Point of No Return podcast. Don't miss an episode by subscribing on iTunes or Google Play.